We're examining a life that, fundamentally redefined what it means to be a global designer. Today, we're doing an extensive exploration of the career and the truly astonishing legacy of Pierre Cardin.
Cardin is such a fascinating figure. He was born Pietro Costante Cardin in Italy in 1922 and later became a naturalized French citizen. A grand couturier, really, known all over the world for his avant-garde, very geometric space-age look.
Right, the space age aesthetic.
But our sources show he was also an architect. And I don't just mean of clothing. He was an architect of modern industrial-scale commerce itself.
And that dual identity, that's the core of it, isn't it? The high artist versus the relentless, maybe even ruthless businessman. That's the tension we really have to unpack.
It is.
We've got a detailed stack of biographical and career sources that trace his entire journey, from a post-war apprentice in Paris all the way to a global brand phenomenon whose name, in the end, was on everything from museum-worthy couture to bicycle accessories.
So our mission for you is to explore this critical duality. I mean, how did one man build a reputation on creating this untouchable, futuristic high art while at the same time becoming the undisputed king of extensive product licensing?
And what does that mean for fashion today? Did he democratize design, as he claimed? Or did he just dilute his own prestige for profit?
That's the question.
It's a spectacular narrative. It's all about ambition, art, and some very calculated risks. We'll trace his foundational years at Dior, the technical genius behind that iconic bubble dress, his unexpected and dominant shift into men's fashion.
Which basically launched the Peacock Revolution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the full force of his space-age designs, and critically, the colossal, just unprecedented scale of the brand licensing that came after.
To really understand the ambition that fueled Pierre Cardin's entire career, you have to look beyond the sleek geometry of his clothes. You have to go back to his beginnings.
Right. He was born Pietro Costante Cardin in 1922, near Treviso in northern Italy.
And the sources are clear that his family wasn't poor. Quite the opposite. They were wealthy wine merchants. But World War I and its aftermath completely upended their lives.
Their prosperity was essentially destroyed by that instability.
It was. The financial losses, combined with the rising political volatility in Italy specifically, the need to escape the increasing power of the black shirts, it all prompted the family to relocate.
So in 1924, when Cardin was only 2 years old, they moved to Saint-Étienne, France.
And you have to imagine that early experience of losing everything, of moving as a refugee, it must have instilled this incredibly potent drive for security and success later in his life.
That certainly explains the later focus on building an undeniable financial empire. I mean, even when it meant facing a lot of artistic criticism, it's an economic sensibility that's just married to an artistic one.
Absolutely. But his father didn't see fashion as the path to that kind of stability, did he?
Not at all.
His father really insisted he should study architecture, a stable, technical, respectable profession. But Cardin, even as a child, showed this singular interest in dressmaking.
So he just ignored his father's dream for him.
He did. By the time he was 14, he had started a formal apprenticeship with a tailor in Saint-Étienne, a man named Louis Bonpuy.
So the foundation of his career isn't some abstract design theory. It's the practical, hands-on, meticulous discipline of tailoring, the cutting, the stitching, structuring fabric to, defy gravity.
That is such a crucial distinction when we look at his later mastery of geometric form. That discipline, that hands-on skill, it never left him.
And he eventually moves to Paris in 1945.
Right after the Second World War. And for a brief time, he did actually study architecture and even tried acting for a little bit. But his professional career really began when he merged his tailoring skills with the dramatic arts.
That seems like a perfect bridge into the world of couture.
It was. He was introduced to the visionary filmmaker and artist Jean Cocteau, and Cocteau hired him to create the costumes for his 1946 masterpiece film, Beauty and the Beast.
La Belle et la Bête.
Exactly. Cardin himself later said that this work, coming from theater and film, was where he earned his first real money and truly began his journey.
That experience, designing for a world that has to be larger than life, it must have been the perfect preparation for the theatrical demands of Parisian high fashion.
Mm-hmm.
What was his path after Cocteau, leading up to Dior?
He did positions at two major houses, first at Paquin and then for the great Elsa Schiaparelli. But before he landed at Dior, there's a really fascinating footnote in his early career.
Oh.
He tried to get hired by Cristóbal Balenciaga, the legendary god of pure craft, 3 separate times, and he failed every single time.
Wait, the sources make a point of him failing to get hired by Balenciaga?
Right.
Why is that such a pivotal detail?
It speaks volumes about his self-awareness and his ambition. He considered Balenciaga gigantic, the greatest creator. Cardin knew where the absolute pinnacle of uncompromised pure craft was.
So being rejected by that pinnacle.
It might have subtly freed him later on. You know, if he couldn't be the heir apparent to Balenciaga's kind of technical austerity, maybe he felt justified in embracing a much wider, more commercial path. It's a fantastic psychological starting point for his later move into licensing.
That puts a whole new spin on his later career decisions. But ultimately, it was Christian Dior who saw his skill.
Yes. In 1947, he was hired and given the critical role of head of the tailleur atelier.
And we should clarify for you, the listener, the tailleur atelier is the heart of the custom tailoring workshop in a couture house. It's where the heavy structural work happens, the jackets, the suits, the coats.
It's where the real architectural magic is applied to fabric, as opposed to the flou atelier, which handles the soft, draped materials.
So Cardin, the tailor, was placed in the most technical structural part of the house, right at the moment Dior was about to change the world with a new look.
It was a perfect match. Dior was getting his inaugural Carole collection ready, which introduced that famed tiny waist, the padded hips, the full skirt everything we now call the new look.
And Cardin was a direct contributor to that.
A major contributor. He personally worked on one of the collection's most globally popular and successful pieces, the bar suit. That piece alone showcased his early mastery of intricate tailoring, especially in manipulating fabric to get that precise structure and pleating.
And the sources note that even during his time at Dior, which was just about 2 years, he was already experimenting with ideas that were almost too futuristic for the new look.
That's right. Some of the suits he produced had skirts with these separate, almost flying panels of fabric. It suggested a kind of fluid, mobile element, a prophetic hint of the movement and geometry he would fully embrace decades later.
And by 1950, he was ready to go out on his own.
He officially founded his fashion house, and he gained notice very quickly, not just for his structural suits, but through some really high-profile social commissions.
Like the Ball of the Century.
A massive boost. In 1951, he was commissioned to design about 30 unique costumes for this spectacular Venetian masquerade ball hosted by the art collector Carlos de Bestegui. That put him on the international cultural map instantly.
And that same year, he hired an assistant who would become crucial.
Andre Oliver. A pivotal partnership that would define his professional and his personal life for more than 40 years.
Then comes the design that really made him a household name internationally. The bubble dress.
After he got his haute couture line going and joined the Chambre Syndicale in 1953, he opened his first boutique, Eve, the very next year, 1954. And with it, he introduced the bubble dress.
And it was an immediate shock to the system.
A seismic shock, really.
So what made the bubble dress such a technical marvel, beyond just its appearance?
Well, it was a short-skirted, sphere-shaped structure. The genius was all in the execution. To get that perfect sort of inflated yet contained volume, he used the bias cut technique.
Which means cutting the fabric against the grain.
Exactly, which gives it stretch and drape. But, and this is the key, he laid this bias cut fabric over a stiffened base. Sometimes a very light wire or a stiff underlining that created the foundational structure, forcing the fabric into that perfect, floating, rounded shape.
So it was avant-garde sculpture, but you could actually wear it.
And easily wearable. That was the magic. It wasn't just a museum piece.
So he was taking a really complex tailoring technique and using it to create a shape that just defied the dominant lean silhouettes of the era.
He was, and by 1957, his collections were commanding serious global attention. That year's collection was crucial because it showed his range. He emphasized 2 contrasting silhouettes at the same time.
Okay, what were they?
First, there was the lean, simplified, unwaisted chemise dress. It really anticipated the looser shift shapes that would dominate the early 60s.
And the second was the wonderfully named navette line.
The navette. It's French for weaving shuttle. And if you picture the shape of a weaving shuttle, that pointed oval, he took that outline and applied it to the skirt.
How did that work?
The design had an unusually high waist, giving fullness over the hips, but then the fabric tapered down severely and drew in tightly right around the knee.
That sounds almost impossible to wear. Like a Greek amphora or a vase. That must have required incredible skill.
It required precision drafting and a combination of stiff interfacing and inner structuring to hold that taper while still allowing the wearer to move. It's proof of why, even before he really exploded, Christian Dior himself publicly suggested in early '57 that Cardin could easily become French couture's leading light.
And when Dior died that October,
Cardin was immediately named by the press as one of the 3 young designers most likely to fill that void.
and he proved his forward-thinking business sense right away by looking east, long before that was common for high fashion.
Absolutely. In 1957, he was the first French couturier to deliberately and professionally target Japan as a major high fashion market. That trip led to his discovery of the model Hiroko Matsumoto,
Who became one of his primary muses.
and a globally recognized face associated with his structural purity all through the 1960s. He was already thinking globally, not just about Paris.
And he also planted the seed for what would become his most profitable pivot, menswear. He opened his men's boutique, Adam, in 1957.
Yes, though he started cautiously, just small items at first, like high-quality, squared-off bodés and unusual, luxurious fabrics. But the seed was planted. It showed an early recognition of the untapped commercial potential in menswear, something his couture peers were almost entirely neglecting.
So, if the 1950s was about building the house on a foundation of genius tailoring and structural innovation, the 1960s was clearly about setting the world on fire.
It was. This is the decade where Cardin transforms from a respected couturier into a full-blown pop culture icon, and it was largely thanks to menswear.
The menswear breakthrough in 1960 was, you could argue, his most commercially prescient move ever.
I think you could. Historically, designer names were exclusively linked to women's wardrobes. Men's clothing was dictated by, traditional tailors, not grand couturiers. Cardin changed that overnight.
And his new look aggressively rejected the loose, padded, conservative suits that had defined men's fashion for nearly 2 decades.
He introduced what he called the cylinder silhouette. It was fitted, it was shaped, it was narrow. Sometimes people called it the cigarette look. It featured natural shoulders, prominent belts, often at a slightly high waist.
And most famously, the high-buttoning, collarless suit.
The collarless.
The cultural impact of that jacket is just immense. I mean, it immediately transcended high fashion and became street style, almost entirely because of one musical group.
It became globally synonymous with youth and modernity thanks to the Beatles. In 1963, the Beatles' tailor, a man named Dougie Millings, famously copied Cardin's 1960 collarless suit design for the band.
And the image of the Fab Four in those clean, minimalist, collarless jackets, it just projected Cardin's aesthetic onto every television set in the world.
It did. And that adoption catapulted him beyond the confines of Parisian couture. It established him as the main non-British figure of the burgeoning Peacock Revolution.
The movement where men began to embrace color, texture, and designer names for the first time, really.
Cardin was the one who successfully taught men that their clothes could and should have a designer's name attached, just as women had learned decades before. And the commercial proof was undeniable.
Oh, the number.
By the end of the decade, specifically by 1968, menswear accounted for a staggering 2/3 of his total apparel sales. He had completely cornered the market.
That financial data is the first major indication of his commercial genius, just superseding his artistic pedigree. He used couture to build credibility, but the real money came from making that aesthetic accessible to the masses, especially in menswear.
It's the perfect example of that art versus commerce tension we talked about. While someone like Balenciaga might have looked down on it, Cardin was building an empire that ensured his brand's survival and prosperity.
And while he was doing that, he was also pioneering his other major influence of the decade, the space age aesthetic.
Yes, which became his signature.
Where did that powerful futuristic inspiration come from? It wasn't just a philosophical idea. The sources say it was tied to geopolitical reality.
It was directly inspired by the Soviet Union. Cardin took a trip there in 1963, right at the peak of the Cold War space race, only 2 years after Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight.
And he was inspired by the cosmonauts.
Deeply inspired, specifically by photographs of Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. Seeing her in her functional, helmeted jumpsuit was a revelation for him.
So the sheer ambition of the space race, that technological optimism, it translated directly onto his runway, resulting in his Cosmocore line.
Right. By 1966, this menswear line was the definition of futurism. It was functional, uniform-like, heavily structural. You should picture jumpsuits, tunics belted low on the hip, flared trousers.
And all characterized by that strong functional hardware.
Exactly. Prominent, often oversized, ring-pulled zippers paired with these minimalist, ultra-modern boots that sometimes went up to the mid-calf or even the knee.
And this wasn't just runway fantasy. He was putting this look into the real world, translating high design into uniform requirements.
A great example is the uniforms he designed for Pakistan International Airlines, PIA, between 1966 and 1971. They were an instant global hit. It showed his futuristic vision was practical and commercially viable for a massive institution.
Now, for women's wear, the space-age aesthetic allowed him to be even more daring with materials and geometry.
The women's wear was pure sculpture. It featured extreme mini lengths, stark geometric cutouts, we're talking T-bar necks, large circles, target patterns on A-line shift mini dresses.
And he pushed the boundaries with non-traditional materials.
Absolutely. He used things like metallic silver leather, high-gloss vinyl, phosphorescent fabrics, and his own chemically engineered, heat-molded Cardin fabric.
Cardin fabric. What was the technical innovation there?
Cardin was a fascinating creation. It was a synthetic blend that could be heat-molded into permanent, rigid geometric shapes. This meant he could create dresses and coats that held these sharp architectural angles that traditional woven textiles just couldn't achieve without heavy interfacing or wiring.
So it was the perfect textile expression of his architectural background.
Exactly.
And the most controversial part of this, pushing the envelope into nudity, were the cutouts.
Yes, he was the leading proponent of the cutout trend. He used them to reveal the midriff or the back beneath an overlaying geometric shape. The most famous, or maybe infamous, were the large, circular cutouts he presented in 1968.
Which were sometimes placed directly over the breasts.
Yes. They were intended more as a philosophical statement on the liberation of the body than as a commercially intended garment, a piece of provocation.
And yet, despite this high artistic risk, he also introduced an incredibly practical and versatile styling technique that made his futuristic structures wearable for everyday women.
The key was layering. He, along with other futurist designers, popularized the concept of a foundational layer. A ribbed knit body stocking or a tight turtleneck and tights worn underneath the geometric jumper mini dresses.
So even with the most daring cutouts or shortest hemlines, the wearer still had modesty.
And it provided a smooth, clean base for the structural outer garment. This look was frequently finished with high leather or vinyl stretch boots that went all the way up to the thigh.
That structural mastery is just undeniable. But here's the fascinating contradiction. Cardin, the architect of the space age, the champion of unisex looks, he initially had a very traditionalist view on women wearing pants.
It's an almost unbelievable paradox. Even as he was inspired by cosmonaut jumpsuits and putting ring-pull zippers on his Cosmocore line, Cardin publicly resisted and denounced women wearing trousers for everyday use.
And this was after André Courageous had already started promoting them heavily in 1964.
Right. Cardin maintained that very traditional stance all the way until 1968.
So what broke the dam? How did he justify the shift?
When he finally did introduce trousers for women in 1968, he framed it not as a concession, but as part of an even more progressive movement, unisex fashion.
A clever pivot.
A very sophisticated one. He launched an entire line featuring identical garments, tunics, turtlenecks, hip belts, flared trousers, those iconic boots, designed for and marketed to both men and women. It was a brilliant way to pivot and align himself with the broader sociocultural revolution of the late 60s.
And all this time, the business expansion was moving beyond apparel entirely.
It was. Cardin was already seeing the potential of his name across all goods. At the end of 1968, he opened Environment, a store dedicated to furniture and interior decor. This was a clear signal of diversification, a rehearsal for the licensing explosion that would define the next decade.
And we can't overlook his massive cultural footprint, especially in film and television, which helped embed his geometric style into the public consciousness.
He was a favorite of the cinematic world, particularly for actresses like Jean Moreau, who was also his romantic partner for 4 years in the 1960s.
He costumed her in some famous films.
He did. Films like Joseph Losey's 1962 film, Eva, and Francois Truffaut's famous 1968 thriller, The Bride Wore Black. His designs were instantly recognizable, sharp, severe, modern.
And on the small screen.
He cemented his role in British pop culture by designing Patrick Macnee's wonderfully tailored costumes for the 1967 season of the cult UK television series, The Avengers.
It's clear that by 1970, Cardin had mastered both the art of couture and the art of cultural saturation. But the next 2 decades would reveal just how far he was willing to push that business model.
As we move into the 1970s, Cardin's career becomes this complex study in opposition. On one hand, he's continuing to produce artistic, often eccentric designs, pushing the boundaries of construction.
And on the other hand, his brand is becoming a mass-market behemoth, which resulted in this constant, audible friction with fashion critics.
Exactly.
The 1970s were tough for high fashion in general. There was a global shift towards casualization, and the industry tried and largely failed to dictate hemlines with the disastrous midi skirt trend. How did Cardin navigate that instability?
He often stood apart. By the mid-70s, his women's wear was frequently labeled as eccentric, too futuristic, too structural, too large, especially when you compare it to the relaxed boho styles and wrap dresses that were dominating the market.
But his output was enormous.
The sheer volume compensated for it. His shows were huge, sometimes featuring hundreds of outfits. So while the spotlight fell on the extremes, he was also offering more wearable pieces.
But he never abandoned the space age entirely, did he? Unlike many of his contemporaries.
He held onto that aesthetic longer than most. He would continue to blend the futuristic with the soft. For example, he might pair a flowing, tiered chiffon skirt, a very soft material, with a severe vinyl geometric jacket.
And what about the hemline wars? The mini versus the midi?
When the industry tried to impose mid-calf midi skirts in 1970, Cardin, along with Courges, was one of the few prominent designers to continue featuring and advocating for the miniskirt in his couture collections.
That's a crucial position to take. He was seen as defending personal choice and fashion, not just following industry mandates.
And he even played with skirt length further by combining the mini and the maxi. He introduced this fascinating, almost transitional look, featuring very short skirts with long dangling panels or fringes or even pom-pom features hanging down to the ankle. He called it mod chic.
A fusion of the extremely short and the ankle length.
Exactly. It allowed him to operate outside the strict rules of the time.
His commitment to futurism wasn't just on the runway either. It became official.
It did. In 1970, Cardin made a pivotal trip to the Johnson Space Center. He was so immersed in the idea of space exploration that he visited NASA and was given this unique opportunity to actually try on Neil Armstrong's original lunar spacesuit.
Wow.
And this was followed by his own practical design work. He subsequently designed specialized spacesuits for NASA that same year.
That experience shows his willingness to prioritize the idea of futuristic utility over pure commercial viability. But it also led to some aesthetic indulgences that weren't so commercially successful.
The sources certainly highlight some missteps. For example, his attempt to bring back huge, opulent ball gowns in luxurious fabrics during the highly casual 1970s was seen as deeply anachronistic.
The public just wasn't interested in that kind of rigid formality.
Not amidst the disco and denim movements, no. And his continued experimentation with internal structure also became increasingly conceptual. It was focusing less on volume and more on movement.
What do you mean by that?
This is a remarkable detail. Beginning around 1972, he started experimenting with lightweight hoops and wiring inside his skirts, even in mini lengths. We're not talking about huge crinoline hoops. These were slender, flexible hoops placed near the hemline.
And the purpose was in volume.
The purpose was purely kinematic. It was to create a jiggling, undulating, kinetic movement in the fabric as the wearer walked, making the garment seem almost alive. It was an artistic concept, really.
And Cardin's influence, throughout the 70s, it extended far beyond the traditional fashion capitals. He became a kind of unique cultural diplomat.
He had a massive presence in the Soviet Union. Following his early inspiration from Tereshkova, he became known as the most prominent non-Soviet designer there. He developed a close friendship with the legendary ballerina Maya Plisitskaya, whom he met in 1971.
And she became a muse.
A friend, a muse, and a frequent wearer of his designs. She cemented his popularity and influence in the USSR, an influence that later extended to dressing political figures like Raisa Gorbachev in the 1980s.
And he also got involved in redesigning a national garment in Southeast Asia.
Yes, in 1971, he redesigned the Philippines' national costume, the Barong Tagalog. Historically, the barong was often elaborate, with heavy embroidery and specific cuffs. Cardin simplified it dramatically.
How so?
He tapered the body for a cleaner silhouette, he reduced the embroidery, and he removed the cuff link requiring cuffs. This streamlined redesign was strongly favored and promoted by President Ferdinand Marcos, which again highlights Cardin's role in global cultural diplomacy.
As the 70s drew to a close, fashion trends shifted back towards structure, moving away from soft silhouettes. This structural revival must have played directly into Cardin's innate strength as a master tailor.
It was a perfect storm for his return to prominence. The late 70s and early 80s embraced structured shapes, often referencing the powerful 1940s silhouette with its broad shoulders. Cardin was uniquely positioned to lead this.
And he showcased some of the broadest and most severely tailored shoulders in all of Paris.
Which brings us to a specific, unique architectural detail, the pagoda shoulder.
What was that exactly?
Cardin introduced the pagoda shoulder in early 1979, and this was not just a broad shoulder pad. It was a sophisticated architectural detail where the padded shoulders were tailored and structured to cant dramatically upward and outward at the outer edge. It gave the impression of a sharp, concave slope.
And the sources connect this directly to his increasing involvement in Asia.
Yes. The distinctive upturned outer edges were directly inspired by the sight of traditional Chinese rooflines, which he had observed during his increasing travels there. This Asian focus was formalized in 1979 when he began working as a consultant to China's Agency for Trade in Textiles.
And he hosted the first fashion show by a Western designer in China in decades.
A huge cultural moment. And his love for geometric severity continued fiercely into the 1980s, where he doubled down on his most eccentric techniques. The 80s were all about power dressing and geometry.
And Cardin embraced that.
Huge, wide shoulders, often rivaling the scale of designers like Claude Montana. He continued to play with the rigid geometry he loved, molding squares, hearts, or triangles directly into the sleeve tops. And he didn't abandon his structural tricks. He continued wiring hoops into sleeves and the hems of short skirts, ensuring the fabrics maintained a sharp, undulating definition.
So now we arrive at the defining business narrative of his life, the licensing empire. The tension between Cardin, the architect of high art, and Cardin, the manufacturer of thousands of, non-adjacent commercial goods. It just exploded in the 1970s and 80s.
This is where we have to stop and really talk about scale. While he was showing gravity-defying pagodas and spacesuits in Paris, the brand itself underwent this radical, almost uncontrolled expansion.
He fully embraced the idea that a designer's name could and should extend far beyond the traditional luxury goods perfume. Scarves, maybe glasses.
Far beyond what other fashion houses were willing to do.
So how extensive are we talking? What were the numbers behind this expansion?
The scale is just staggering. By the late 1970s, his name was on well over 2,000 different products. They were distributed in more than 120 countries through a network of more than 350 separate license programs.
And the product categories were wildly non-adjacent. It reflected a philosophy of total brand ubiquity.
It did.
Give us some of the most surprising examples the sources mentioned. It wasn't just clothing and accessories, right?
Oh, not at all. It was everything. Cookware, flatware, heaters, lamps, desk sets, bicycle accessories, garden hoses, stoves, even wine. It's hard to find a product category that didn't feature the Pierre Cardin logo at some point.
He treated his name as a marketable stamp of taste and quality, no matter what the object was.
That's right, and this generated incredible, unprecedented financial success, but it came at the cost of his standing among the fashion elite.
The critics were brutal. The sources quote them, saying his cachet crashed.
It did, but the financial returns were undeniable. By the late 1980s, his network had grown to about 800 licensees globally. Wholesale sales were estimated at $1 billion annually.
Which earned Cardin personally a colossal sum.
Around $80 million annually from royalties alone.
The criticism was that a luxury brand relies on exclusivity and rarity. And once you put the name on everything, from a high-end suit to a cheap plastic keychain, you dilute the very prestige that allowed you to charge high prices in the first place.
That is the core of the debate. Critics quoted in the sources were horrified. They claimed he had sold his name for toilet paper and argued that the proliferation of his name on cheap goods undermined the integrity of his couture house. They saw it as financial greed, destroying artistic value.
But Cardin had a philosophical defense for this, didn't he? He argued it wasn't just about the money.
He absolutely did. Cardin's counter-argument, which he stated frequently, was that the future is luxury for all. He believed it was snobbish to restrict good design to only the wealthy elite.
So he saw the proliferation of his name as a form of artistic democracy.
Exactly, bringing style and a sense of refinement to mass-market goods, whether it was an affordable flatware set or the interior of a mid-range car.
So he viewed the critics as elitists who wanted to keep good taste locked up.
Precisely. for Cardin, the sheer profitability of the licensing proved that the public valued his aesthetic and that his name had immense commercial value, even if the goods were non-adjacent to fashion. It forced the entire industry to confront the reality that a designer name could be a global industrial commodity.
And while others like Ralph Lauren and Gucci later built successful empires through licensing.
Cardin pushed the envelope further than anyone before. He established the template for the modern, multi-category designer brand.
Cardin's involvement wasn't just limited to signing licensing contracts, though. He was an active, hands-on industrial designer, specifically making a mark on automobiles.
His first notable foray into automotive design was for the French Simca 1100, where he designed the interior in 1969. But his most daring, almost outlandish collaboration was with the American Motors Corporation, or AMC.
That was a bold move for a French couturier to partner with a Detroit automaker in the early 1970s.
It was revolutionary. For the 1972 and 1973 model years, Cardin designed a specialized trim package for the AMC Javelin. It was one of the first American cars to offer a unique interior designed by a famous Parisian fashion figure.
And this was during a period when Detroit interiors were notoriously conservative.
Very.
So what made this interior so dramatic? We need to visualize the full aesthetic force of Cardin's geometric style applied to car seats.
It was pure, unadulterated 1970s Cardin. The interior featured a dramatic, mirrored, multicolored pleated stripe pattern. The color palette itself was high fashion meets muscle car. Bold tones of Chinese red, plum, white, and silver, all set against a severe black background.
So the seats looked less like upholstery and more like a geometric abstract painting.
The sources described it as one of the wildest fabrics and patterns ever seen in any American car. It completely defied the convention of the American consumer at the time.
It sounds like a true collector's item now. How many of those unique javelins were actually produced?
Due to the specialized nature and the limited years of production, only 4,152 of the AMC Javelin Cardin Edition cars were ever made. It was a spectacular, if short-lived, collision between Parisian avant-garde and Detroit steel.
And finally, he expanded his interest beyond design and into hospitality and real estate, securing a massive cultural landmark in Paris.
In 1981, Cardin acquired the incredibly prestigious and iconic Parisian restaurant, Maxim's. This was more than a business deal, it was a cultural acquisition, and he immediately leveraged the Maxim's brand to expand his cultural influence in Asia.
By opening an outpost in Beijing in 1983.
Yes, and this was hugely significant. Maxim's in Beijing became one of the very first international high-end luxury brands to operate in mainland China during that era. It positioned Cardin as an unparalleled cultural bridge builder.
And the restaurant is still there.
It remains an enduring cultural landmark in the city. He also purchased property like the historic Venetian Palazzo, Ca' Bragadin, a building associated with Casanova, further cementing his interests in cultural preservation and international presence. Cardin's career was a testament to creative stamina, and it was supported by a cohort of influential muses and collaborators who helped translate his often extreme ideas into cultural movements.
We've mentioned several key figures. There was the model, Hiroko Matsumoto, who brought an elegant architectural purity to his early designs, and the actress Jean Moreau, who embodied the sophisticated, slightly rebellious woman of the 1960s.
A relationship that lasted 4 years, and then the figures who tied him directly to the geopolitical and cultural pulse of the Soviet bloc.
Cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova,
whose image in her functional spacesuit inspired his entire space-age aesthetic. And the formidable ballerina Maya Plisitskaya, a long-term friend and muse who showcased his designs all across the USSR, paving the way for his influence on figures like Reza Gorbachev.
We should also note the structure of his personal life, which often blurred with his professional one.
Yes. While Cardin openly described himself as mostly gay, his life included both that significant relationship with Jean Moreau and his foundational long-term business and life partnership with André Oliver.
Oliver was his associate designer for decades.
Right alongside him until his death in 1993. This blending of professional and personal relationships seemed crucial to the success and the longevity of the House of Cardin.
And Cardin himself maintained extraordinary longevity, remaining active and directing his sprawling empire long past the age where most people retire.
He truly did. Though he reduced his runway shows in the 1990s, he continued to oversee his brand until his passing on December 29, 2020, at the age of 98. He never sold his company or relinquished control.
He ensured that his philosophy, that combination of high art and relentless commerce, remained intact.
It did.
When we look at the legacy, it's clear that Cardin's prolific, often criticized, and highly commercialized approach to branding fundamentally altered the trajectory of haute couture. Every designer today who licenses perfume or housewares or car interiors owes him a debt of gratitude or perhaps a critical reckoning.
His career forces us to ask a crucial question that the industry still struggles with today. If a structure or a silhouette is avant-garde enough to earn a spot in museum, but the label is simultaneously on thousands of mass-produced, highly affordable, lower-priced goods, whether it's a kitchen appliance or a tie, does that commercial ubiquity automatically erode the artistic value?
Or, conversely, did his mass market approach simply make high design globally accessible, broadening the cultural conversation around fashion in a way that actually protected the longevity and financial solvency of his core artistic house from the pressures that sunk many of his contemporaries?
It is a fascinating dilemma for you to mull over when you next see a designer name on a product that seems wildly out of place.
Thanks for listening.